الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم ابتغاء مرضات الله وتثبيتا من أنفسهم كمثل جنة بربوة أصابها وابل فآتت أكلها ضعفين فإن لم يصبها وابل فطل والله بما تعملون بصير. Allah Almighty says in chapter 2, verse 66 of the Holy Quran, in the case of those who spend their wealth to seek the pleasure of Allah and to strengthen their souls is like the case of a garden on elevated ground. Heavy rain falls on it, so that it brings forth its fruit twofold. And if heavy rain does not fall on it, then light rain suffices, and Allah sees what you do. In this verse, the analogy of rain and of a garden is given to describe our the value of our actions and the faith that's behind those actions. And this analogy is not something that is used only in this verse, but it is something that is very common and fundamental in the Holy Quran. In the very beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah Almighty describes the basic principle that إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, that those who believe and do good works, that lahum jannatun tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, for them are gardens beneath which flow streams. So this is an analogy that has been given many times in the Holy Quran, and it describes the most basic of things, our faith and good deeds, that which makes up what religion is about. In commentary of this, Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salatu wasalam described that in these verses, faith and actions are related to gardens and streams, meaning that our faith is like a garden and our actions are like streams, and both of them come together and sustain, and the sustenance is interdependent on each other. Now when we see this analogy that Allah Ta'ala has given us and how it relates to us, and it opens up different aspects of the philosophy of good deeds and the philosophy of faith. Now Allah Ta'ala has described water as being like good actions, and water is something that, as we know, is fundamental to life. Wherever there is a river, wherever there is a source of water, there is a source of life there as well. There is vegetation, there are gardens. In fact, it is known that even in deserts and places that have never had life for long periods of time, when water flows there, or when it rains, then suddenly out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, vegetation sprouts and life comes out of nowhere. So the beauty and value of water is in life. Without life, water does not have any value to us as human beings. This is a part of our history as a species. It is a part of our relationship with this most basic thing. In fact, even when we look in outer space, searching for life on different planets, whether it's on the moon or Mars or somewhere else, our main objective is to search for water, because they are so interlinked. We know that if we can find water, then there's a possibility that there's life there, and there's possibility that life can be sustainable there. So this is the value of water, and this is what Allah Ta'ala has related to the doing of good actions. Now, faith, Allah Ta'ala has related to the actual life, to the garden that has been created as a result of that water. Without that garden, that water becomes meaningless. So similarly, if we do actions without any faith, then those actions become meaningless as well. They don't produce anything of value. They're just empty. And if we imagine a river flowing through a desert, but it provides no actual benefit to that desert, no life comes about, then it's a useless river. It's beautiful to look at, but it actually has no productive value. So this is the same thing with our actions. This is an analogy that I've given before as well, that if a person does plenty of good actions, if he is great as a neighbor, as great as a friend and all these things, but he neglects his physical health, then he's still going to suffer and die a painful physical death. He's going to go into a physical hell. From the perspective of physical actions that are good for our physical body, those actions that are not helpful towards that purpose are meaningless. So similarly, if a person is not mindful of their spiritual health, no matter what good actions they do in their imagination, it is of no actual value. So this is that analogy. If a person has what they imagine to be a river of good actions flowing through their heart, but it does not produce any actual faith, it does not lead to a relationship with Allah Almighty, then their heart is a barren desert. It does not produce anything. And on the other hand, a garden is not something that can be sustained without actions. A person can imagine in their heart that they have the fire of the love of Allah Almighty, that they have all of this enthusiasm. But if it is not backed up with some kind of action, then that garden is something that withers away. It's not something that can be sustained. It's not something that can be survived. So actions have to be there. Now the beautiful thing in this verse is that Allah Ta'ala says that heavy rain falls on it, so that it brings forth its fruit twofold. Allah Ta'ala describes that when the water of those good actions, those amal salihah that we do, when they water that garden, then Allah Ta'ala blesses it so that that garden creates and produces great fruits for us, fruits of faith that are multiplied for us. But even if our actions are weak, Allah Ta'ala says that if heavy rain does not fall on it, then light rain suffices. And this is something that we observe in nature as well. Of course, heavy rain is something that creates lush greenery. But in many places, as we know, life is resilient. Even a small amount of water is something that can sustain beauty and vegetation. So this is an analogy that Allah Ta'ala has given us for spirituality, that even if you are weak, but as long as you keep consistent action, as long as you continue to provide that garden with some level of water, then it will suffice. It will provide that greenery and that life and that lushness within the heart, within our hearts, and within the faith that we need. Now this verse is related to financial sacrifice. And here we can see the wisdom of why Huzur Ayyadahullah has said that although the lazmi chandajat are there and they have that minimum that has to be maintained, that is a minimum. To maintain a garden, it needs this minimum amount of water. It has to be there. But on the other hand, Huzur has said that for those voluntary chandajat like Tariq-e-Jadid and others, he said that everyone should participate. Even if you just take $1 or 50 cents, he even went down to 5 or 10 cents. Take something. Just make sure everybody contributes something. So that guidance of Huzur is a tafsir and a commentary in a way on this verse, that there should be some type of precipitation, even if it is very light rain. It's something that will sustain that greenery that is needed for the faith in our hearts. But if there is no precipitation whatsoever, then that faith dies as well. And this is why we see that although people who imagine themselves as having great enthusiasm in their hearts, when the time comes to sacrifice and the time comes to act, that is when they fail. That is why Huzur Ayyadahullah also says that although slogans and enthusiasm and emotion have value, but he also emphasizes that then when the time comes to act and to work, we have to work as well. When we see Huzur and when we are around him, we are filled with enthusiasm and slogans. But then when the time comes to act, then there is no action. It shows that it was just a dead garden. It withered away a long time ago. We just thought that it was there. So that enthusiasm is something that can only be sustained when there is a continuous precipitation there. When we get into the habit of sacrifice, even if it's a small sacrifice, if there's a precedent in our hearts, if there's a stream flowing, however small that stream is, at least it makes a groove within that ground. It makes an indentation in that ground so that then when water flows there again, it goes down that same stream. If there's no indentation, no precedent, then the water just goes everywhere. It's wasted. So when a person has some precedent in their heart for sacrifice, no matter how small it is, then when a great sacrifice is asked of him, then he follows that same pattern. Then we are able to offer a greater sacrifice on that foundation that we established before. So that light precipitation, that small sacrifice that we do consistently to sustain that garden, it establishes the foundation of sacrifice, of actions by which we can sustain that heart, that flourishing faith that exists within us. So this is an analogy that the Holy Quran has given, carrying forward a principle that the Holy Quran has described on the relation of good deeds and faith. And here in this verse, the good deed of financial sacrifice is described and how it is necessary to be able to sustain our faith. And it is a reminder for us on the importance of financial sacrifice for ourselves, for our own selves. Now, if the priority was for the sake of the Jamaat, then Huzur would not bother with saying that even collect a few cents from people. That shows that it is the interest of the Jamaat is not there, the interest of our individual is there. In the moment of that advice, our personal benefit is what is of highest priority. And if we benefit from that advice that is for our personal benefit, then primarily and firstly we will benefit. And then when we are able to sacrifice and fulfill our responsibilities for the Jamaat, then, as this verse describes, the fruits will come twofold and will be multiplied for us. So this is the relationship from one angle that the Holy Quran describes of faith and good deeds. So now, if there's any questions that anyone has, then we can briefly address it.
So Murtab, you mentioned that a person who has good deeds but doesn't have faith, it's just like a river flowing through a desert. But in this world we see a lot of atheist people who have no faith, and for whatever the reason they have not exposed to or whatever turned them away. But they're tremendous work for humanity, and they do really good deeds. So what happens to those people? What happens in their afterlife, for example? I mean, they have done nothing but spend their money and time and went to the people in Syria and like all those areas.
So as I described, our actions are related to the direct consequences that we're seeking. We can't take one action and then apply its consequence to something unrelated. So the analogy that I had given is of physical health. Now the basic answer to that question is only Allah knows best. We can't judge, but I can give an answer as a general principle, and that is that our physical health requires certain actions, and our spiritual health requires certain actions. The same way we have a physical body, we have a spiritual body, and both of them need a specific type of actions in order to sustain the life within them. Now, a person, no matter how great of a person he is, all the sacrifices he makes, he goes to Syria and everything, but if he does not look after his physical health, it's not going to save him from obesity. It's not going to save him from physical ailments. And he's going to suffer and live a life of physical torture if he ignores it. Now, a person might look at him and say that, why is nature so unjust to him? Look how great of a neighbor, how great of a philanthropist he is. But despite that, he's one who is in a physical hell because of his ailments. That objection wouldn't be just, because we know there's laws of nature. There's laws of physical nature that have to be respected. So also there's laws of spiritual nature that that a good action in the sight of Allah Ta'ala has to be according to a certain criteria. Now, religion has not come to make us good human animals, because we could be good human animals without religion. Even among animals there is philanthropy, there is caring for one another, there is sacrifices, there are mothers who die for the sake of their children, there are tribes that go to war and fight and then die for the sake of their tribe. All these different types of things happen. The purpose of religion is not to make us into a good human being, it's to make us a being who rises above our physical nature and develops a relationship of love with our Creator. That's what the paradise is that Islam has promised. And that spiritual paradise can only be attained through spiritual actions. Now, it's not fair that a person would say that I want and expect a spiritual paradise when they don't even believe that a spiritual existence exists, and they have done nothing to sustain their spiritual life at all. If a person does good deeds for the sake of the physical world, then he receives his reward in the physical world. He knows what his action is, what his reaction is. That we know in the physical world there are people who live and die who sometimes are rewarded in this life for their physical good deeds, and sometimes they just die without having ever been rewarded at all. So when a person does good deeds for this world, he should do it with the expectation that I will receive my good deeds in this world. But when a person accepts spiritual reaction to his actions, and there has to be a spirituality within that action to get a spiritual reaction. So the paradise of Islam is not something that is given just for anything. It's a very specific thing. It is something that is given as a spiritual life for a spiritual reward for spiritual good deeds. So that's a principle that Islam is taught. But then, as a mercy, if Allah Ta'ala sees that an atheist is good at heart, that he sought the truth, that if he had better opportunities, he may have found Allah Ta'ala and would have been sincere in his love, Allah Ta'ala can also always forgive, Allah Ta'ala can always reward that person for something. ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. That no one has a right to object. Allah Ta'ala can give his fazl to that person even if he wants to. But what I can say in principle, and I think even an atheist could agree with this, that if there's no, it's just logical that a spiritual reward is for a spiritual action.
There are some persons, they think that they have some other charities, they are more desirable than Jamaat, and they put a lot of money there, and they don't fulfill our Jamaat chandas. And there are some persons, they don't care even, they don't care about chandas. So what you going to say? Can you repeat the question?
So the question is basically, what about if we give in charity, but then to secular organizations, but then we fail to pay our chanda? Now, giving in charity to secular organizations, of course, is a good thing. It's something that is to be encouraged. In fact, of course, as long as that charity is not going to a other religious organization that uses some of those funds towards their own religious purposes. If it's purely secular, then it's fine. But like you mentioned, if a person neglects their chanda and then does a nafl, then that's basically, whether a person neglects their zakat, which is farz in the Quran, or the chanda, which has been made obligatory in their bayt, the bayt that they took voluntarily and has been made obligatory on them by the promised Messiah and Khulafa. It's the same thing as neglecting farz and doing nawafil. Now, a person can say that I'm not going to do the farz namaz, I'm not going to read fajr, but I'm going to do nawafil at ishraq time. So the reason why that doesn't make any sense is because the reason we're doing those rakat in the first place is to earn Allah Ta'ala's pleasure. And so we can't earn the pleasure of Allah Almighty by disobeying Him. Now it's the same thing as if we tell our children to do one thing and we know they don't want to do it. And just out of rebellion they say, I'm not going to do that one thing, but then they say, I'll do something else, as an excuse to try and cover up the fact that they don't actually want to obey us. It's not something that's going to make us happy, it's not something that's going to please us. So what Islam has taught is that a good deed is obedience to Allah Almighty. No action in and of itself is inherently good, in that it is just a good deed by itself. That's why Islam has described good deeds as amali salihah, deeds that are done according to the correct time and place. Not that just an action in and of itself universally is good. No action is good in and of itself. So if a person gives to secular charity, then they can hope for a secular reward. Whatever it is, that's just whatever they expect. Perhaps they expect a tax deduction. Perhaps they expect that people will praise them and they will be seen as philanthropy, as a generous person in society. Or maybe they do it for the personal pleasure that they find in serving their fellow man. That's also a reward. So they should expect that reward and they should be happy with that reward, whether it's a feeling of satisfaction or praise from others or the tax deduction, whatever it is. But it is irrational to expect that they will receive a spiritual reward for it, because their intention was not a spiritual reward. Their intention was to do this in disobedience of Allah Almighty. So they'll have their reward in this world, but it is naive and it is in fact illogical to expect anything in the hereafter for it, unless Allah Ta'ala has mercy and is forgiving. Okay, so then we can do Salatul Isha now.